All right, so we're talking today about Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365. And I know that a lot of you already know about Azure Virtual Desktop because we've been selling it to our clients for a little while as a solution, mostly to replace like a remote desktop server in a client's environment. As that technology is kind of aging and going away, Azure Virtual Desktop is kind of the way of the future. But I also wanted to kind of familiarize you all with Windows 365 because it is an option for our clients in some circumstances, and I want to make sure that you guys know the difference and when it might be a solution for our clients. So let me just get started here. And we're going to start with the Windows 365 architecture, and basically all of these, just so you know, all of these solutions are for virtual machines in the cloud for different users. And there's different use cases that we might use one solution versus the other. So Windows 365 and AVD are both built on the same underlying architecture in the Microsoft Azure environment. But we do have a couple of different ways to get those virtual machines to our clients' users. In the Windows 365 architecture, there's two different types of virtual machines. One is your business cloud PCs, and the other is your enterprise cloud PCs. And the basic difference between the two is whether or not it can connect to your corporate resources. So can it connect to your file server? Can it connect to your domain controller and be joined to the local domain? Can it connect to your scanners and your printers in the office? All of that kind of thing. Those options are only available in your enterprise cloud PC model. Your business cloud PCs are connected to your Azure AD, your Azure Active Directory or Entra Active Directory now. So everything is joined to Azure Active Directory for authentication. So they have to log in to their Microsoft account in order to get into their PC. But your business cloud PCs are just a standalone PC. It's not connected to any of your resources. It's like if your client went out and bought a PC at Best Buy and they're using it in their corporate environment. It's not going to connect to anything, but they can use, Office on it. They can connect to the internet on it. They can save files to OneDrive and SharePoint if they need to save files to the corporate environment. They can do that. Your enterprise cloud PCs can be connected to your Azure environment itself. So if you have cloud servers, like you have a cloud domain controller, or if you have a file server or Azure Files or something like that, the enterprise cloud PCs have a virtual NIC, network card in your Azure environment that allows them to connect to all those things. And then if you also have a site-to-site VPN from your Azure environment to your on-prem environment, they can also connect to on-premise printers, on-premise scanners, your NAS that's on site, let's just say, or anything like that that's in your client's on-prem environment. Those enterprise cloud PCs can also connect to those resources as well, which makes it very similar to your Azure AD environment in that way. Now, the difference between your Windows 365 machines and your Azure AD machines is basically how it's being billed and if there's variable billing or not. So your Windows 365 machines have a fixed billing price per month. So it's going to be assigned to a specific user, and they're billed that amount every single month. All right, so next thing, I want to talk about kind of the summary of technical architecture that goes into. Like I said before, everything is built on kind of under the hood. It's all built on that Azure Virtual Desktop technology. In your Windows 365 environment, everything is fully managed by Microsoft if it's on the business side. If it's an enterprise machine, everything is managed by Microsoft except for your networking, which is managed by the customer. On the AVD side, everything is customer managed. Your compute cost for Windows 365, it's all standard. You get to choose which level you're buying at. So you can say, hey, my client has a user that needs 2 cores and 8 gigs of RAM and a 256 gigabyte hard drive. So it's basically you're telling them the size of the machine, and it gives them that size of machine. They can use it however much they want in a month. It doesn't matter. Their cost is going to be the exact same. A couple of other things to note here. All of the user profiles, and this is for our solutions architects more so than the account managers. The user profiles are stored locally for your Windows 365 machines. So when we say, hey, we're going to give them a 256 gigabyte hard drive, all the users' data is stored locally on that machine. It doesn't go into Azure Files or FSLogix like it does with Azure Virtual Desktop. So over here on the Azure Virtual Desktop side, you use FSLogix for your user profiles, especially if it's a pooled Azure Virtual Desktop. For identity, for your Windows 365 business, everything is Azure AD joined. You can't connect it to ADDS, and you can't connect it to a local domain. Whereas if you have enterprise machines, or if you're using AVD, you can do those things. You can join it to a local domain, etc. Let's talk a little bit about the IT management, how we as Antiva will manage these machines. So when we have Windows 365 machines, it's an individual machine. On the business, if it's a business size machine, there is no admin portal. We really don't have much control over those machines except through Automate. So we can install our Automate agent on it and have a certain level of control and patching on that machine. But there's no real kind of centralized management of those machines. When we start getting into our enterprise machines, you can manage them through Intune, or that's the primary way that they are managed, is through Intune. We can also install Automate on those machines, but we don't have any access to the underlying VM, so we can't manage it in that way. There's no monitoring or anything like that. Whereas when we get into the AVD side, everything is managed. You can manage the devices in the Azure portal, in the GUI, and you can manage them through Intune, you can manage them through Automate. All of the ways we normally manage a machine are available for AVD machines. The other thing that I wanted to note on this slide in particular is backups and DR. So a lot of times the client may ask, and I know there's several clients that are very uptight about their backups and how they're managed and like that. For these Windows 365 machines, we don't have you can't back them up to a Datto. You can't back them up with a Veeam. The only way we're going to get backups of those are kind of at a file level backup. So installing an agent on the machine that backs it up to something like Sky Data Vault or something like that. When we go over to the Azure Virtual Desktop side, we have the full range of options when it comes to backups. So you can back up through Azure Backup. You can back up through Veeam if you have a Veeam server and you need that CMMC compliance or FIPS compliance. You can back up through Veeam. You can back up through Datto. If they have an on-premise Datto, you can actually back it up through the site to site if you want to. So there's a lot more options and flexibility and scalability when it comes to the backups and the IT administration when we're working with Azure Virtual Desktop. We already talked about networking being not so flexible when it's business side Windows 365, more flexible when it comes to enterprise Windows 365 or your Azure Virtual Desktop. There's no scaling. It's a fixed monthly cost per machine, per user, when it comes to your Windows 365. And those machines can't be like transferred from one user to another user. Basically, if your user leaves, you deallocate their machine and you can set up another one for a new user. But there's no kind of given, hey, let's give this machine to another user within our environment. You can't do that. However, on the Azure Virtual Desktop side, it's very flexible. there is scaling. You can, like we use Nerdio to do auto scaling for Azure Virtual Desktop. So that could mean we're turning the machines off when they're not in use. Most users aren't logging in at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. So we're going to turn those machines off and only have the start on demand feature turned on for Azure Virtual Desktop. So if a user does happen to log in at 1 a.m., if they're overseas, on vacation, they log into their machine, it'll actually start up the VM in the middle of the night for them. It might take 2, 3, 4 minutes for the machine to start up, but the client isn't paying for all of that time to have a VM running. All right, so there is auto scaling and different things that we can do on the AVD side that we can't do on the Windows 365 side. Let me go to the next slide, talk about user experience. There's actually very little difference in the user experience between Windows 365 and AVD. Users are going to go to a portal. They're going to go to a URL. Now there is a desktop application that we can install on a machine that will log them into basically that portal if it's AVD. Otherwise, they can go to URL for AVD, or they can go to URL for Windows 365 to log into their machine. There is a slight difference when it comes to printing and scanning. With business machines, you only have the ability to do the redirected printing through the client, whereas with both AVD and with the enterprise Windows 365, you can do the redirection, universal print, and network-based printing. So if they need to print to an on-prem printer, they can do it using the enterprise PCs or the AVD machines. There's a couple of things that a user can do from the portal in terms of self-service. If their machine locks up, they can restart it if they have a Windows 365 machine, whereas with AVD, they cannot do those things. We have to do that for them. If there's something wrong with a machine, we have to do a restart. We can manage that through the Nerdio manager as well if we want to go that route. Something that's going to be really important here is going to be the licensing for each version. Everybody that accesses either Windows 365 or Azure Virtual Desktop is going to need some kind of Windows 10 or Windows 11 enterprise licensing. And that usually comes through, it's either an add-on license to their base license, or it comes as a part of their subscription suite. So if they have Microsoft 365 E3 or E5 or Business Premium, that actually comes with the licensing that's needed for both Windows 365 and AVD. Your compute and storage costs, when it's Windows 365, everything is kind of lumped in together to that Windows 365 license. When we're talking about AVD, the storage and compute costs are based on consumption. So that's why we have that auto scaling that turns machines on and off when we have AVD. So it's because they're going to get a bill based upon how much consumption they use, how much compute they use, how much storage that they use. And that goes the same for networking. AVD is based on consumption versus the business Windows 365 is included in their license. Just a note here for Intune, if you have enterprise PCs, cloud PCs, you're required to have Intune because that's how they're managed. Whereas with the business PCs and AVD, that is optional. For Office subscriptions, you can have any Office license you have. So you can have Business Standard, Business Basic, and use the Windows 365 machine. So you can have any Office subscription. With AVD, because it's a multi-user environment, you have to have the Office subscription with SCA rights. And SCA is the shared computer activation license. So that you have to have that license that comes with the multiple user activation. And those, again, it's part of your E3, E5 business premium licensing suite. Any questions so far?
Bob, Frank here. Quick
Yeah,
question, sir. So with the business, by chance, is there an option for a client to install a VPN client to kind of jerry
to get
rig
into
that a
their
bit?
environment. I'm not sure about that. I mean, we could definitely see if we can test that. I don't know if there's a way to do the VPN client. You're talking about like if they have a business Windows 365 business
Right,
and they want to
yeah,
connect to
either
the
be an
local.
always on or like a client
Right.
VPN, some sort of a
Yeah, but that's something I think we'd have to test.
right, right. Okay. And then next question, if I may, just to have another.
Yeah.
So was from a supportability perspective, is this more of just a general, hey, these are the capabilities, or are we actually able to support these if we start quoting and doing
Yeah.
these?
No, we're still able to we're able to support these. The Windows 365 machines are kind of always on. So we manage them like we would any other personal, desktop PC.
We're able to install automate on them, right?
Correct. Yeah, we would have
Okay.
to install automate on them to be able to support those. With AVD, I mean that's kind of lumped
Yep.
into the product that we already have. Yep.
Okay. And Nerdio to manage everything, or
Yeah. So whenever we create a quote to implement AVD, it includes Nerdio.
but Windows 365 is just a part of the O365 license. There's no Nerdio play there, if you will.
Correct. That is
Okay.
correct. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
I think Ted and Sal had hands up. Ted?
All right.
I
Ted, you
did,
have something?
yes. Well, Nerdio.
Yeah.
I remember a little while back we were getting rid of Nerdio, and I had a couple clients we did projects to remove Nerdio. Is Nerdio being continued? Is Nerdio back?
So that was
Or
that
was
was
it different setup?
an old different product from Nerdio.
Okay.
So that was a product that Microsoft discontinued. So that's why we had to move those clients from the Nerdio. I think it was Nerdio. It was a Nerdio RDS environment that was
Different
being
technical scenario.
correct. Yeah. So
Thank you.
this is a
Okay.
different product. Yep.
It is going to be confusing them as me if we suddenly propose Nerdio again when we charge them to remove it. So
Yeah. So
thank you.
this is correct. Yep. Sal.
So what's the business case for 365, Windows 365? I understand AVD, but what is really the business case for you would pitch 365?
Yep. I'm glad you asked. That is actually my next slide. So let's
Oh,
so the next two slides here are a cost comparison, and then we're going to go to a summary and kind of use cases for each different scenario. So your cost comparison between the different types of users will determine whether we go with Windows 365 or whether we go with AVD. So if you have a kind of light users that are using really small machines, they need dedicated personal desktops. Your user price per month for Windows 365 is going to be lower than it is if we were to do AVD. The savings now, just a couple of caveats here. So this slide here makes the assumption that there's a minimum of 10 users in your AVD environment. So that's how they're comparing them here. And also, from my experience, we don't get a whole lot of these 1 vCPUs and 2 GB RAM users. Those are extremely light usage users. I think most of our users are going to either be in this basic or standard user category. So we're really talking about starting at $41 a month for a Windows 365 environment, and then one of these other categories for AVD, whether it's personal desktops with pay-as-you-go and auto scaling, you can get it down 15%. If you have pooled users, with 3-year reserved instances. You can get it down, almost 60% from the cost of a user on a Windows 365 environment. But I think that's kind of what the differences are. Like, do we have users that need a personal desktop, or can they be pooled users that don't need to, they're not going to be using up all of the resources on the machine itself? So that's kind of the cost comparison. And that leads me into kind of the summary of when we would use one service versus another. Kind of the best use case scenario for a business machine is if you have temp workers or contractors that are going to use it for a couple of months, and then we're going to turn the machine off, and they don't have to have access to corporate resources. So they're only going to be using SharePoint and OneDrive to store company files. Windows 365, now and we're giving them personal machines. So like we had a client who had 2 users in India that were contractors that they want to be able to connect to machines that they control, right? So that might be a good scenario for that client. If they have temp workers or contractors that they only want them to log in and use certain applications, and we control that VM, Windows 365 Business might be a good use case for that client. However, if they wanted those users to be able to connect to a file server or connect to a NAS, or print to a plotter that's in the office, let's just say, then we would say those probably need to be Windows 365 enterprise machines, because it's going to be a personal machine and they need to access corporate servers, printers, local resources, and it's fewer than 10 users. Then that's a good use case scenario for your Windows 365 enterprise machines. Once we get more than 10 users logging into an environment and they can share the machines, they need connections to corporate resources, then we need to start having a conversation with the client about Azure Virtual Desktop. One of the biggest impediments to a client implementing Azure Virtual Desktop might be the project cost. Your project cost is usually like $8,000 to $12,000 to actually implement Azure Virtual Desktop. So if they have less than 10 users, they might just want to pay the monthly cost that's gonna take to have an individual machine for each user in the cloud. But if they have 55, 60 users and they want to be able to have auto scaling, and they want to save money in Azure, and everybody can have a shared environment, that's when I think we're really going to say ABD is going to be the best bang for your buck. And you're going to get a good return on investment over time.
Bob, to piggyback on that,
yeah,
especially with the cost wall, if you will, right, to pay to play into Azure Virtual Desktop. What are the talking tracks for clients that are thinking down that road versus purchasing their own computers, let's say, right? Because you're right, with Windows 365 Business and or Enterprise, it's great for like temp workers, right, where they may not need to invest in a laptop for a seasoned person,
right,
and to just pay a few $100s. They tax it out however they want to tax it out as an operational expense, right? But what are the
yep.
talking tracks for that?
So I mean, if you have a client that even with longer term employees, they want to have a BYOD policy where they can just work from a tablet or something, but they want to have all of their data stored in an environment that they control. I think we might want to talk to them about Windows 365 if they want to eliminate that hardware expense, right? But have kind of an ongoing
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
go
our
ahead.
clients that have old computers and they're thinking about, does it make sense to replace those or do go this route, right? That's another talking track, I presume.
Right.
But from a supportability, like I think we and Tiva, right, would want all the machines that we have to manage be under warranty, right? So I guess that's a philosophical question from support
Yeah.
versus technology there.
Well, and I know there are some companies too that are going to a kind of a tablet or even like a Chromebook. I don't know that we want to recommend Chromebooks to our
Yeah,
clients
yeah,
as the end user machine, just because it's a cheaper hardware investment, and then they don't have to have as many controls on those endpoints, and then they can have all their users doing all of their work in a cloud environment.
right. Again, the challenge there is supportability for the Chromebooks because I know we won't touch that with 10-foot pole, right? So it's just making sure that the technology exists, but do we have the support structure aligned so that there are no silos between what we deploy as a project versus what support is going to ultimately want to support.
Correct. Yeah. So I think in our client's environment, normally if they're going to have a Windows 365 environment, we're going to be supporting the Windows 365 machine or the AVD machine
Mhm.
and the end user's machine as well, right? So we're going to have an automate agent on both.
I got you. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Because there are some support issues that just boil down to, a local machine setting or, something like that. So from a supportability standpoint, Intiva is going to want to support both machines.
Right.
But like to your point, like maybe they don't have the money to upgrade their machines. They have fairly old machines, or if they want, like there's kind of a happy medium between, hey, here's a Chromebook which we don't want our users to use or our clients to use, and here's a desktop or a laptop that costs them $2,000. That might there's kind of there could be a happy medium there, with a tablet or something that
And
might
how
be
does how would, if it does, like we have that new PC deployment cost structure now built into our service agreements. Does that play into it as well, right? That's something that
it
we need to
does.
consider.
Yeah, so it does kind of go into that as well. Where just from the standpoint of like the enterprise machines are Intune managed. So if the client has Intune already rolled out, they're not going to pay a rollout or a setup fee for us to configure that enterprise machine, right? Uh, Whereas the Windows 365 business machine, they might have to pay a fee to get that machine set up and installed the way the client needs to use it. With Azure Virtual Desktop, a lot of the times,
There's no need
but
for another,
there's no need for it, right? There's no need
right.
for continually setting up new machines because it's the Azure Virtual Desktop machine is based upon
Cool.
an
Yep.
image, right?
Yep.
So, Mark.
So I'm not very familiar with this. I'm wondering if you could kind of just dive a little bit deeper on when we would recommend something like this. So I guess as a hypothetical, a client has an on-prem server, they want to move to the cloud, we move them to Azure. When would we recommend these options along with that Azure migration?
Yeah. So it really depends on, so if the client has an on-prem RDS environment, so their users are using a remote desktop server kind of as a virtual desktop for their users. If we're doing a cloud migration, we might recommend Azure Virtual Desktop as part of that migration, because we don't necessarily want to migrate the RDS server to the cloud if that's just going to be replaced by AVD, right? So that's kind of one aspect of when we might recommend AVD. Another aspect of when we might recommend something other than AVD, I've had conversations with clients where they have contractors where they don't want those contractors accessing resources on their network. So they want something entirely separate that their contractors are going to be working on. Then we might want to recommend Windows 365 machines for those users.
Yeah, to Bob, your point earlier, like if there have users in India and we put up a conditional access to block access from outside the US,
Right.
this is a great alternative for those external users.
Yep. Absolutely.
Got it. Thanks.
Yep. What other questions do we have?
Bob, do you know if there's are there any issues with compliance on this? I assume that it fits kind of standard Microsoft like GovCloud. It all works
Yep.
out.
Yeah. So I don't know about Windows 365. I do know that, you know, AVD is built within the Azure tenant of the client. So if they have a GCC or GCC high tenant, the AVD machines will be built into that tenant.
Yeah, I don't know if Windows 365 has any Azure, not Azure, GCC or GCC high SKUs.
Mm-hmm. I'll see if I can find something on that.
Does anyone have a client that currently has AVD deployed at a large scale, like greater than 100 users? Curious to know what those service tickets look like.
Yes. Didn't Cordia? They had a large AVD rollout, I believe.
Weren't they in ECAP one time?
I thought they were at one time. I thought we moved them to AVD. I don't remember. Sorry, it was a long time ago.
KVS did a rollout, Bob. It's about 85 users for
Okay.
AVD. They use it with a couple of third-party applications. It works very well.
Is client Jonathan?
KVS title?
Thank you.
Sure.
So just a quick search on the previous question. There is a Windows 365 government.
Gotcha. That's good to know. So it's GCC. Not sure if it's GCC high though, but regardless, that's good to know.
Mm-hmm. It says Windows 365
GCC
government
high,
customers are government agencies. The services in GCC and GCC high clouds.
GCC and GCC high. Yep.
Yep.
Just seeing it now. Okay. Cool. Awesome.
Yeah. What other questions we have?
Hey Bob, does that cost comparison chart take into consideration the Nerdio costs?
I don't know. I think that
so.
cost comparison actually, I probably doesn't.
And
That
also,
that cost comparison actually did come from the Nerdio website, so it might, but I doubt it.
Yeah,
Also
I
our,
thought the 15 per user was kind of low with the Nerdio
Yeah.
costs.
Right. Yep.
and also to that point, I don't think we mark up the Windows 365, but the AVD has that 20 points, right?
Yep, that's true.
There are specific SKUs in our catalog for Windows 365 machines. So I'm assuming those come with the markup.
Can you create an image for a Windows 365, or is it really Intune driven?
You can create an image for enterprise.
Enterprise only. Okay.
Enterprise only. Yep. With the Windows 365 Business, you have to use one of the Microsoft images.
Okay. But you could push policies through Intune.
Correct. Yep. Marco.
Hey, Bob. Bob, I may have missed this, man. Apologies. So, Virtual Desktop is from an account management standpoint, it's a pain in the ass. So we in my experience with this solution, it's not stable. I've tried it on the private sector, and I've also worked directly on it on the government sector, and it's constantly with issues. So what is our position on the SLA standpoint with respect to uptime guarantees and outages? Had we come across that yet on how we will cover our our butts here if anything was to go down?
So I would say that, I mean, Microsoft probably has SLAs for AVD. Let me just see here.
Yeah,
But yeah,
yeah, like
Go
I
ahead.
think the SLAs with Microsoft, I think it's understandable, right? When client, like if it's in their environment, as long as we're not hosting it, I don't think that's going to be a problem, right? Like if we're hosting the Azure for them on their behalf. But yeah, some clients, they like to have some sort of protection with discounts and stuff like that for major outages. So I was just wondering if we're going to point that right back at Microsoft, which I think we should.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it was just a concern of mine.
Marco,
Yeah. No.
for
Sorry, go ahead.
outages, yeah, for outages, typically it's the verbiage that Microsoft has is that you have to alert of the outage, and then they will do like a bill back. So it's on the end user to notify that there's an outage.
Okay.
So the language is very, unless there's like a national outage or a region outage, and then they'll do a credit. But you said which service was very unreliable?
So I Azure Virtual Desktop, and then the other one that I've actually come across too is Citrix. The
Yeah.
not at yeah. I think there's two different, but there's VDI Virtual Desktop interface, and then the Azure Virtual Desktop.
So yeah, for VDI it would be unique because that's going to be the client's own equipment and how it's hosted. So it's going to be very much client specific. But
Yeah.
for the Azure hosted desktop, that's a surprise because I've used it fairly often on the Antiva side, and it's been pretty reliable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
no. I'm just
yeah.
more concerned about the ownership, right? When there is an outage or something. I just, because one of the things that it's easy for us to say, hey, we're at the mercy of Microsoft, right, for a resolution, than it is, hey, you know what, we got to figure out how we can credit you or something. But that's just a little concern of mine. That was all. But you're saying we're protected. Yeah.
If you hear of recurring outages with like AVD, definitely kind of mark them because it's supposed to be it's a service, so it's pretty much bulletproof. It runs in multiple regions. Like there might be an issue with their browser, there might be a workstation issue, there might be a circuit issue. It could be more than just Azure, and we may want to investigate in-depthly on what's causing those issues.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So it looks like they're 99.99% uptime for virtual machines, which is AVD is a virtual machine in Azure. So my guess is, but like there's this caveat here too that's deployed across 2 or more availability zones in the same region, which I don't know if that is standard for our rollout. Our deployment is to have multiple machines in multiple availability zones. I think it is. I think it's done automatically by default, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, in the systems that I've where I've seen, it was a single server. There wasn't any redundancy in place like across different Azure servers. You had to build that out.
Right.
Okay.
Correct.
Well, no, but this is good. At least, yeah. It's just one of those things that I feel like we just gotta be careful with because it will disconnect, right? For one way or one reason or another.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I'll
go to Kevin.
It hasn't been something that I've been told that is a problem. Uptime, but I I could just not be in the loop from a support standpoint. So
Good. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
Thank you, Bob. This is pretty awesome, dude.
Sure, absolutely. My pleasure. If you guys come up with any questions that you want answered, just let me know, and I'm happy to answer them.